All right, good afternoon. Welcome back. Today we're going to work on Chapter 16, Section 2. We are going to talk about the Aztecs. And this that you're seeing here would be an artist rendition of Tenochtitlan, which would have been the Aztec capital. Let's get started. All right, the Aztecs built an empire. The first Aztecs were farmers who migrated from the north to central Mexico. Finding the good farmland already occupied, they settled on a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And this, what they'll do is they'll turn this island into kind of a fortified island, and it will really be an impressive feat because they will make this watered, marshy area into a basically into an empire where they'll be able to grow their own crops and they'll become very powerful. There in 1325, they began building their capital and conquering nearby towns. War was a key factor in their rise to power, and they fought fiercely and demanded tribute payments from the people they conquered. I mean, I think I've seen the numbers that they expected 2 million shirts a year to be made and sent to them from the people who were under them, and just other things like gold and crops and these types of things. So, I mean, they expected a whole lot of tribute from the people who were under their empire. Many goods and precious metals poured into the empire and became an important part of their economy. They also controlled a huge trade network, and many of the merchants doubled as spies and brought information about what was going on in the empire back to the rulers. So, the rulers, because it was such a large empire and there wasn't the type of communication we have, they would send out merchants who would go to sell things, and they would come back with information for the rulers on what was going on. War, tribute, and trade made the Aztec empire strong and wealthy. And by the early 1400s, they controlled the most powerful empire in all of Mesoamerica. Basically, they were in the southern and middle part of Mexico. The capital of Tenochtitlan showed the empire's greatness. To build this amazing island city, they first had to overcome many geographic challenges. So here would be kind of a map from the top. And as you can see, they're on this island inside this lake. And they'll actually expand out. And what they would do is they created ways to be able to grow crops in the water. So it's a pretty interesting, you can see there's multiple ways across. But to defend the city, all you really had to do was defend the roads. And otherwise it was pretty much impossible to try to invade or attack the city. And here you can see a rendition in Mexico of what Tenochtitlan was. It was difficult to get to the city, so they first had to build 3 wide causeways or raised roads across water or wet ground to connect the island to the lakeshore. They also built canals that crisscrossed the city, and these made travel and trade much easier. And you can see the causeways coming out, and then you can see the different canals that will crisscross, and work their way through the city. Tenochtitlan's location also limited the amount of land available for farming. So to solve this problem, they created floating gardens called chinampas, where they piled soil on top of large rafts, which they anchored to trees that stood in the water. And then you would have basically the soil on the raft, and you would have the roots of these plants would go down through the raft into the water, so they always had this constant water source. They never had to water their crops. The Aztecs made Tenochtitlan a magnificent city with about 200,000 people at its height, with huge temples, busy markets, and a grand palace. And here is, once again, an artist's rendition of what you would have seen in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs' way of life was as distinctive as their capital and had a very complex social structure, demanding religion and a rich culture. Now, Aztec society. The Aztec emperor was the most important person in society. That makes sense. Anytime you have a king or an emperor, they typically are the single most important person. From the great palace, he attended to law, trade, tribute, and warfare, and trusted nobles helped as tax collectors, judges, and other government officials. So he had nobles that would always help him out. Nobles' positions were passed down from fathers to sons, and young nobles went to school to learn their responsibilities. So much like nobility was in Europe, it was passed down. The difference is you would go to certain schools to learn what it was you were supposed to do to help the emperor. Just below the emperor and his nobles was a class of warriors and priests. Warriors were highly respected and had many privileges, but the priests were more influential. Priests held ceremonies, passed down history, and kept the calendar, so they decided when to plant and when to harvest. So, the priests were so important because they're the ones who would decide when it would be time to plant the crops or, produce the food. The next level of Aztec society included merchants and artisans. The lower class were the farmers and laborers who paid so much in tribute it was often hard for them to survive, and they were the majority of the population. Then the lowest class below them were the slaves, and that's typically how it works. Now, religion and warfare. They worshiped many gods they believed controlled both nature and human activities. And to please the gods, the Aztec priests regularly made human sacrifices. Unfortunately, they sacrificed a lot of humans to the gods. Most victims were battle captives or slaves, much like the Mayans. And the Aztecs sacrificed as many as 10,000 people a year. So to supply enough victims, Aztec warriors waged frequent battles with neighboring peoples. This will be one of their major downfalls and part of the reason why their neighbors hated them so much. Now, cultural achievements. The Aztecs appreciated art and beauty, and architects and sculptors created fine stone pyramids and statues. And here you can see some statues. Artisans used gold, gems, and bright feathers to make jewelry and masks, and you're seeing this kind of things here. And women embroidered colorful designs on the cloth they wove, so you're seeing that here. The Aztecs valued learning as well, and they studied astronomy and created a calendar much like the Mayan calendar, and it was very accurate on times of the year. They kept detailed records of their history and had a strong oral tradition. Stories about their ancestors and gods were passed from generation to generation, and they enjoyed listening to speeches and solving riddles. Now, Cortez is going to conquer the Aztecs. Hernando Cortez was a conquistador. In the late 1400s, the Spanish arrived in the Americas seeking riches and converts to Catholicism, which was basically the Catholic Church. One group of Spanish conquistadors or conquerors reached Mexico in 1519, and they, like I said, Hernando or Hernan Cortez was their leader. The Aztec emperor was Moctezuma II. He believed Cortez to be the god Quetzalcoatl, whom the Aztecs believed left Mexico long ago, and according to legend, the god had promised to return in 1519, and he was also seen as a very pale individual, which would make sense when the Spanish showed up and they were lighter complected. Moctezuma gave the Spanish gold and other gifts, but they wanted more. So he actually originally is going to kind of shower them with gold, and that's going to send them kind of into this frenzy where now they want more riches. Cortez took Moctezuma prisoner, enraging the Aztecs who attacked the Spanish. They managed to drive out the conquistadors, but Moctezuma was killed in the fighting. Within a year, Cortez and his men came back, but this time they were reinforced by other natives in the region that resented the Aztecs. Remember how I said, they treated the people very badly, execution, these types of things, and were expecting all these gifts and tributes. So this caused there to be a lot of enemies. So when he comes back, the conquistadors had a few things on their side. First, they had a large number of natives who were now their allies ready to take on the Aztecs. Secondly, they had cannons and guns and armor, which they did not have, the Aztecs did not have. But the biggest thing was their disease, and especially smallpox. So the conquistadors also had armor, cannons, guns, and swords, and the Aztecs were terrified of their horses, which they had never seen before. The biggest ally was the European disease, and smallpox was such a deadly disease, it actually killed off like 90% of the native population. These diseases weakened or killed thousands of native people, and by 1521 the Aztecs surrendered and their empire ended. Now that's it for chapter 16, section 2 of the Aztecs. If you got any questions, get a hold of me. Make sure you're doing the readings and getting the work done. Have a great day.